No saw could cut the log. When he opened it, he froze at the sight of what was inside. David Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his dirt-stained hand, looking once more at the log that had challenged him for 3 days. His bills were piling up and the kids were asking when there would be food on the table, but that piece of wood simply refused to yield. He had found the log during his daily search for firewood on the abandoned lot on the outskirts of Riverside, where he had been working since losing his job at the factory. The wood seemed ordinary at first glance, nothing to indicate any difference from the other logs he cut every day. But when he positioned his old electric saw and pulled the trigger, the blade just skidded across the surface without even making a scratch. "Must be a problem with the saw," he muttered to himself, turning off the equipment and examining the blade. But the saw worked perfectly on other logs. He returned to the same spot the next day, determined to overcome that obstacle. This time he tried different angles and pressures, forcing the machine until the motor almost overheated. Nothing. The log remained intact. Buddy, his black mutt, watched everything with interest, sometimes barking at the log as if he too were frustrated with the situation. The animal always accompanied him on his work journeys and seemed to understand that something was different that day. "What do you think, Buddy?" asked David, scratching the dog's head. "Never seen anything like it." On the third attempt, David made a desperate decision. He borrowed a more powerful saw from his neighbor Richard, promising to pay with part of the firewood he managed to cut. "This one can cut through concrete," Richard assured him, handing over the heavy tool. "But be careful not to hurt yourself, David. This machine doesn't forgive." Back at the lot, David positioned the new saw on the same spot he had tried before. The motor rumbled powerfully, promising success. But when the blade touched the wood, the result was identical to the previous days. The saw skidded without being able to penetrate even a millimeter. "This is impossible," he said aloud, turning off the machine and stepping back a few paces. Buddy approached the log and began sniffing intensely, running around the wood as if picking up an interesting scent. The dog's strange behavior caught David's attention, who had never seen him act that way. When he got home that afternoon, Jennifer, his wife, immediately noticed his discouragement. She was preparing a simple dinner with the few ingredients left in the pantry. "How was it today?" she asked, although his expression already answered the question. "There's a log out there that doesn't want to be cut," replied David, washing his hands in the small kitchen sink. "I've already tried with 2 different saws. Nothing works." Maria stopped stirring the pot and stared at him with that look he knew well, the same one she used when she thought he was wasting time on nonsense. "David, you have 500 other logs in that place. Why don't you leave that one and get another?" "It's a matter of principle," he replied, knowing he sounded stubborn. "Never in my life have I found wood my saw couldn't cut." "Principle doesn't pay the light bill," Jennifer retorted, turning her attention back to the stove. "And the bill is due tomorrow." Little Michael, his 8-year-old son, appeared in the kitchen at that moment, his school uniform dirty from playing in the dirt. "Dad, the teacher said I need to bring materials for the science fair, can I?" David felt a tightness in his chest. He knew he didn't have the money to buy the materials his son needed, and seeing the expectation in the child's eyes hurt him deeply. "We'll see about that later, son," he said, avoiding looking directly at the boy. Jennifer gave him a disapproving look over her shoulder. She knew David was suffering from not being able to adequately provide for the family, but his stubbornness with that log was becoming a problem. The next morning, David woke before sunrise, determined to resolve the situation once and for all. This time, he also took an axe he had inherited from his grandfather, an old but well-kept tool that had always been stored in the small shed. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. The abandoned lot was shrouded in morning mist when David arrived. Buddy followed him as always, but this time the dog seemed more agitated, running straight to the problematic log and barking softly. "Easy, Buddy," said David, preparing the axe. "Let's see if Grandpa was right when he said old tools are more reliable." He positioned himself firmly, raised the axe above his head, and delivered the first blow with all his strength. To his surprise, The blade sank a few inches into the wood, producing a different sound than he expected, almost as if there was a hollow space underneath. "Got it," he exclaimed, examining the cut. "Let's see what you're made of, my friend." Blow after blow, David opened a crack in the log. The work was arduous, and soon his hands were full of blisters, but he persisted. After an hour of intense work, he managed to open a crack wide enough to see inside. What he saw took his breath away. There was a cavity inside the log, and in it, carefully wrapped in oiled cloths, were objects that shone with a golden light, even in the morning gloom. "My God," he whispered, the axe slipping from his trembling hands. Buddy approached and began barking excitedly. As if he also sensed something extraordinary was happening, David looked around, making sure he was alone on the lot, before kneeling down to examine the discovery more closely. Inside the cavity were jewels, gold coins, necklaces, rings, and even some pieces that appeared to be ancient relics. Everything was meticulously organized and protected from moisture. It was obvious someone had hidden those treasures on purpose, turning the log into a natural safe. David's hands trembled as he picked up one of the gold coins. It was heavy and had engravings he couldn't understand, but its authenticity was unquestionable. There was enough money there to solve all his financial problems and still have plenty left to give his family a decent life. But along with the euphoria came fear. Who had hidden this there? Why had they chosen exactly that spot? And more importantly, would they come back to retrieve the treasure? "Calm down, David," he said to himself, taking a deep breath. "Think clearly before doing anything foolish." He carefully gathered some of the smaller objects, wrapped them back in the cloth they were in, and put them in his pocket. The rest remained in the log, which he closed up as best he could, disguising the opening with dirt and branches. On the way back home, his mind raced with questions and possibilities. Should he tell Jennifer? What if someone saw him messing with the log? What if the original owners showed up looking for it? Arriving home, he found Jennifer hanging clothes in the backyard. She immediately noticed his agitation. "Did you manage to cut the log?" "I did," he replied, trying to sound casual. "It was harder than it looked, but I did it." "Great. Now you can get back to working properly and stop with this stubbornness." David nodded, but his heart was still pounding. He locked himself in the bathroom and examined the pieces he had brought again. They were definitely valuable, but he didn't have enough knowledge to assess how much they would be worth. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety and anticipation. During lunch, he almost let something slip about his discovery, but managed to control himself. That night, when the family was asleep, he stayed awake, planning his next steps. The next morning, David returned to the lot even earlier, determined to examine what he had found more closely. But when he arrived at the spot, he got a surprise that chilled him to the bone. An elegant woman was standing near the tree trunk, looking around as if searching for something specific. She appeared to be about 60, wore expensive but discreet clothes, and had a look of determination on her face. Seeing David approaching with Buddy, she turned and smiled politely. "Good morning," she said, in a polite but firm voice. "Sorry to bother you. My name is Mrs. Margaret Foster. Do you work in this area?" David felt his heart race. Could she be the owner of the treasure? How should he respond without revealing what he had discovered? "Good morning, ma'am. I'm David Thompson." "Yes, I do. I cut wood here sometimes. Are you looking for something?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much she should reveal to a stranger. "Actually, I'm looking for something my late husband hid here a few years ago. I received a letter from him that was only opened recently, with instructions on where to find some family belongings." David's blood ran cold in his veins. This was exactly what he feared. The woman was the rightful owner of the treasure, and he was standing there, with part of it in his pocket, pretending to know nothing. "What kind of belongings?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Jewelry, mostly. My husband was a gemstone merchant. Before he passed, he told me he had hidden the last valuable pieces from our collection somewhere safe, but he only left clues in a letter that was to be opened after his departure." David felt a mix of relief and guilt. At least now he knew the origin of the treasure, and the woman's story seemed genuine, but he was still in a delicate situation. And do you have any idea where exactly he hid these jewels? Margaret took a yellowed envelope from her pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper. He left a kind of map, but the references are very vague. It talks about a tree that guards secrets and a place where wood protects what is precious. I know it's here in this area because he always used to come here for walks. David's heart was beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. The description matched perfectly with the trunk he had opened. Have you worked here long? Have you ever seen any tree or trunk that seems different from the others? David swallowed hard. It was the perfect opportunity to confess everything, return the treasure and do the right thing. But he thought of his son needing school supplies, the overdue bills, the worried look on Jennifer's face every morning. Look, Mrs. Margaret, I know this area well. If you'd like, I can help you search. I have quite a bit of experience with wood. Maybe I can identify something different. The smile that lit up the woman's face made David's guilt grow even stronger. That would be wonderful. I don't know much about these things, and being here alone is a bit frightening. No problem, said David, hating himself with every word. Let's look together. Can you show me the map? Margaret handed him the paper, and David pretended to study it carefully. The descriptions were indeed vague, but he was now certain they referred to the trunk he had violated the day before. Your husband must have loved you very much to have taken such care in hiding these things to protect the family, commented David, trying to understand the woman better. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Richard was always very careful with me. In recent years, he was worried about some business debts. He said dangerous people might try to take our things if they knew where they were. That's why he hid what was most valuable. And now you need these jewels? Yes, I do, she admitted, wiping her eyes. After Richard passed, I discovered he had incurred more debts than I imagined trying to save the business. I lost almost everything. If I don't find these pieces, I'll have to sell the house I've lived in my whole life. Margaret's story deeply touched David. She wasn't a wealthy person trying to recover unnecessary luxuries, but a widow fighting not to lose the last home she had. This made his own situation even more complicated. Let's search calmly, he said. If it's here, we'll find it. For the next 2 hours, David guided Margaret all over the property, making a deliberate effort to avoid the area where the trunk with the treasure was. He needed time to decide how to handle the situation. What a beautiful dog, commented Margaret, seeing Buddy run between the trees. That's Buddy. He always keeps me company. He's a good companion. I had a similar dog when I was a child. Richard always said he'd buy me another one, but we never had the time. The casual conversation revealed more details about Margaret's life. David discovered she was a genuinely good person who had dedicated much of her life to caring for her sick husband in recent years. Each revelation increased the weight of guilt on his conscience. I don't think we'll have any luck today, said Margaret, after examining most of the property. But I really appreciate your help, Mr. David. You've been very kind. You're welcome, Mrs. Margaret. You can come back whenever you want. I'm here almost every day. You wouldn't mind if I brought my nephew tomorrow. He's a lawyer and might have different ideas about how to interpret the map. David felt a shiver of worry. A lawyer could complicate things, especially if he was the type of person who asked a lot of questions. Of course, no problem at all. After Margaret left, David remained on the property, wrestling with his thoughts. Buddy approached the trunk where the treasure was hidden and began sniffing again as if wanting to remind his owner of what was there. I know, Buddy, murmured David. I'm in a difficult situation. That night, David could hardly sleep. He tossed and turned in bed while Jennifer slept beside him, thinking about Margaret's words about losing the house she'd lived in her whole life. At the same time, he remembered the overdue bills, the need to buy medicine for his elderly mother, the dreams he had for his children. Around 2 in the morning, he got up quietly and went to the kitchen for water. In the dark, he took from his pocket one of the gold coins he had taken and examined it in the moonlight coming through the window. It was a beautiful piece, probably very old and valuable. What are you doing awake? Jennifer's voice startled him. She had appeared in the kitchen without him noticing. Couldn't sleep, he said, quickly closing his hand around the coin. You've been acting strange since yesterday. Did something happen? David almost confessed everything right then. The tension of hiding something so important from his wife was becoming unbearable. "Just worried about work, Jenny. Nothing serious." Jennifer approached and put her hand on his arm. "David, we've been together for 15 years. I know when you're lying. What's going on?" He looked into her eyes, seeing all the trust and love she placed in him. She deserved to know the truth, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences yet. "I'll tell you tomorrow, okay? I just need to sort a few things out first." Jennifer studied him for a long moment, clearly unsatisfied with the answer, but nodded. "All right. But don't leave me worried for too long, David. We've always talked about everything." The next morning, David arrived at the lot even earlier than usual, determined to make a final decision about what to do with the treasure. But as he approached the area where the trunk was, he had another unpleasant surprise. There were two men examining the area, one clearly younger than the other. The younger one wore a suit and carried a briefcase, while the older one wore casual but expensive clothes. David immediately suspected it was Margaret, accompanied by her lawyer nephew. "Good morning," greeted David, approaching cautiously. The young man in the suit turned immediately, with an expression David didn't like at all. There was something calculating in his eyes. "You must be the David my aunt mentioned. I'm Brandon Foster, attorney. This is my assistant, Tyler." David nodded politely, but noticed that Brandon was sizing him up in a way that made him uncomfortable. "Your aunt didn't come today?" "She stayed home. Thought it best for me to take a technical look at the situation first. Can you show us where you searched yesterday?" There was something in Brandon's tone that didn't sound like someone genuinely concerned with helping his aunt. David decided to test his suspicions. "Of course, your aunt is a very kind lady. She must have suffered a lot with the loss of her husband." Brandon gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, Uncle Richard was a good man. He left some financial complications behind, but we're taking care of everything. Your aunt told me he was a jewelry merchant." "He was, yes. Had some important clients. That's why these pieces he hid are so valuable to us." David noted that Brandon had said, "to us," and not "to her." A small difference, but significant. During the search of the lot, David observed Brandon and Tyler carefully. They didn't seem to be really looking for lost treasure, but rather examining the place as if they already knew more or less where to look. At one point, he heard Tyler whisper to Brandon, "Are you sure the old man didn't tell anyone where he hid it?" "He was very weak at the end. I doubt he managed to come here alone," replied Brandon quietly. David pretended not to have heard, but the words intrigued him. They seemed to know more details about the last days of Margaret's deceased husband than she herself had mentioned. "Found anything interesting?" asked David, approaching the two. "Not yet," said Brandon, but David noticed he quickly hid something he was examining. "This map isn't very clear, is it? May I see it?" Brandon hesitated before handing over the paper. David noticed it wasn't the same map Margaret had shown him the day before. This one had more details and annotations that clearly weren't in the handwriting of an elderly, sick person. "This map seems different from the one your aunt showed me yesterday." Brandon and Tyler exchanged a quick glance. "Ah, yes. I found some additional notes in my uncle's papers last night, information that complements the original clues." David knew he was lying, but decided not to confront him directly. Instead, he continued observing and listening, trying to understand what Brandon's real interest in the treasure was. After another hour of fruitless searching, Brandon announced they would return the next day with detection equipment. "Detection equipment?" questioned David. "Metal detectors. If there are jewels and coins hidden around here, these devices can help locate them." When the two men walked away, David hid behind a tree and watched them talking near the car. "Are you sure the treasure is here?" he heard Tyler ask. "The old man left enough clues before he died, and now that the old lady has signed the papers, legally I'm entitled to everything that belonged to my uncle," replied Brandon. "And if she finds out, she won't get anything." "She won't find out until it's too late. With the debts he left, she'll be happy just not having to pay anything." David felt his blood boil. Brandon was tricking Margaret, making her sign documents that apparently gave her rights to her deceased husband's estate. She didn't even know she was being robbed by her own nephew. At that moment, David made a decision that would change the course of the entire story. He couldn't allow Margaret to be deceived like that, especially by a member of her own family. But he also knew that simply telling her about Brandon's betrayal wouldn't be enough. He needed proof. For the rest of that day, David stayed on the property watching. Around 4 in the afternoon, he saw Brandon and Tyler return alone, this time with detection equipment as they had promised. Hidden behind a cluster of trees, David watched them using metal detectors all over the area. It was obvious they knew more about the treasure's location than they had admitted. At one point, the detector started beeping near the trunk where David had found the jewels. "Here," exclaimed Tyler, pointing to the area. "The signal is strong here." Brandon quickly approached, examining the spot. David held his breath when he saw Brandon kneel near the trunk he had opened. "Look at this," said Brandon, pointing to marks on the wood. "Someone's been here recently. See these axe marks?" David mentally cursed himself for not being more careful in disguising his digging. "Do you think someone already found it?" asked Tyler, clearly worried. "It's possible. I need to find out who it was. It might have been that David. He knows this area very well." David felt a chill down his spine. If Brandon suspected him, the situation could become very dangerous. "What do we do?" "We'll come back tomorrow morning very early and examine this trunk properly. If someone really found something, we'll find out who it was." After the two men left, David remained hidden for a few more minutes to make sure they wouldn't return. His mind worked quickly, trying to find a way to protect Margaret without compromising himself. When he finally approached the trunk, he saw that Brandon had left marks from his investigation. It was only a matter of time before they discovered someone had breached the treasure's hiding place. That night, David barely touched his food during dinner. Jennifer noticed his restlessness, but respected his promise to tell her everything the next day. The children chatted about school, unaware of the storm brewing in their father's head. "Dad, did you manage to buy my supplies for the science fair?" asked Michael innocently. David looked at his son and felt his heart tighten. With the money from the jewels he had taken, he could buy not only the school supplies, but everything the child needed for a better future. "I'm still looking into that, son," he replied, avoiding Jennifer's disapproving look. Later, when the children were sleeping, David finally told Jennifer everything. He showed her the pieces he had taken, explained about Margaret and her search for the treasure, and revealed his suspicions about Brandon. Jennifer listened to everything in silence, her expressions changing from surprise to worry, and then to something David couldn't identify. "David," she said finally, "are you telling me you found a treasure that belongs to a poor widow, took part of it, and now you've discovered her nephew wants to steal the rest? It's more complicated than that, Jenny. If I return everything to Margaret, Brandon will end up with it all anyway, and we'll still have no money for the family's basic needs. But it's not ours, David. As much as we need it, these things have an owner. What if I find a way for Margaret to get what's hers and Brandon can't steal anything? Would it be fair for me to keep a small part as a reward for uncovering the betrayal?" Jennifer reflected for a long moment. "It depends on how you do it. If you can prove that Brandon is deceiving his aunt and still return to her what is rightfully hers, perhaps she herself will decide to give you something in thanks. But for that, I need more time. And if Brandon finds out I was the one who opened the trunk—" "Then you need to act quickly," said Jennifer, taking his hands. "Do the right thing, David. Doing the right thing has always worked out for us." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. The next morning, David woke up with an idea that had formed during a restless night. Instead of going straight to the property, he went first to Margaret's house. He needed to talk to her before Brandon showed up again. He found Margaret watering plants in a small garden in front of a simple but well-kept house. It was obvious she had lost much of her former wealth, but she maintained her dignity and care for what she still possessed. "David, what a pleasant surprise. How are you?" "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret. I was passing by and decided to come talk to you. It's about the search for your husband's treasure." Her eyes lit up with hope. "Did you find something?" "Actually, I need to talk to you about your nephew Brandon." Margaret's expression changed immediately, showing surprise mixed with worry. "Brandon, why? Did he do something?" David took a deep breath, knowing the next words could change everything. "Mrs. Margaret, may I ask what kind of papers you signed recently?" Margaret seemed confused by the question. "Papers? Brandon brought me some documents related to Richard's debts. He said they were to protect me from having to pay what wasn't my responsibility. Did you read those documents before signing?" "Brandon said they were too technical for me to understand. I trusted him. He's my nephew. He studied law. Why are you asking this?" David knew he was about to break the heart of a woman who had already suffered much, but there was no alternative. "Mrs. Margaret, I have reason to believe Brandon is not being honest with you about his intentions." Margaret's face paled. "What do you mean by that?" "Yesterday I overheard a conversation between him and another man. They were talking about how the papers you signed give him legal rights to your husband's assets, and that you didn't know that." Margaret leaned on the house's gate, clearly shaken by the revelation. That can't be true. Brandon was always a good boy. He helped me so much after Richard passed. I know it's hard to believe, Mrs. Margaret, but I need you to know this before it's too late." "But why would Brandon do such a thing? He knows I have no one else." David felt a deep pain seeing the woman's suffering. Family betrayal was one of the cruelest things a person could endure. "I can't answer that, Mrs. Margaret. I only know I heard him planning to keep everything we find and leave you with nothing." Margaret sat in a plastic chair in the small garden, clearly trying to process the information. "What do I do now? If the papers I signed really give him rights to Richard's things, how can I prove he deceived me?" "First, you would need a different attorney, someone with no connection to Brandon, to review the documents you signed." "But I don't have the money to pay another attorney," David thought quickly. He had an idea, but it would be risky. "Mrs. Margaret, if I can get proof that Brandon is trying to deceive you, and if we can find your husband's treasure, could you use part of it to pay an attorney and nullify the documents you signed?" "Of course. But how are we going to get that proof?" "Leave that to me, but I'll need you to trust me and do exactly as I say." Margaret stared at him for a long moment. David could see she was weighing her options, trying to decide if she could trust him. "Why are you helping me? You barely know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," David replied with total sincerity, "and because no one deserves to be betrayed by their own family." "All right," said Margaret, with a determination that surprised David. "What do I need to do? First thing, don't let Brandon know we talked today. Keep acting normally with him as if you know nothing. It will be difficult, but I'll try. Second thing, when he brings the detection equipment today, let him believe he's in control of the situation. But pay attention to everything he says and does. And third, trust me. I promise I will do everything I can to ensure you get what is rightfully yours." Margaret nodded, and David realized that despite the pain of betrayal, she was determined to fight for what was hers. When David arrived at the property that morning, he found Brandon and Tyler already there, along with Margaret and 2 other men he didn't know. Brandon had brought more sophisticated equipment and seemed to be in command of the operation. "David," Brandon greeted with false enthusiasm. "So glad you came. I brought a team specialized in detection to help us." David nodded politely, but noticed that Brandon was carefully observing his every reaction. Brandon's team concentrated their search exactly on the area where the trunk David had tampered with was located. It was obvious they had more precise information about the treasure's location than they had admitted. "The detectors are showing strong signals here," said one of the technicians, pointing directly at the trunk. "There's definitely metal buried in this area." David watched Margaret throughout the operation. She was making a visible effort to appear normal, but he could see the pain and disillusionment in her eyes whenever she looked at Brandon. "We'll need to excavate," said Brandon. "David, could you help us? You have experience with this kind of work." This was exactly the opportunity David had been waiting for. If they found the tampered trunk in front of everyone, Brandon would be furious and might reveal more about his true intentions. "Of course," said David. "Where do you want me to start digging?" Under the technician's direction, David began removing the earth around the trunk. With every shovel, his anxiety grew. When he finally exposed the trunk completely, everyone could see the obvious marks that someone had tampered with it recently. "Someone has been here before us," said Tyler, confirming what everyone could already see. Brandon approached the trunk with a dark expression. "These marks are recent, very recent." He turned to David with evident suspicion. "You didn't mention seeing anything different about this trunk when we were here yesterday." "Yesterday, we didn't get to examine this area so closely," David replied, keeping his voice calm. Brandon didn't seem convinced, but continued examining the trunk. When he found the crack David had opened, his face transformed from suspicion to pure anger. "The trunk is open. Someone has already been here and taken what was inside." Margaret approached, pretending to be surprised, though David could see she was nervous. "What do you mean? Was there something inside this trunk?" "The map left by Uncle Richard described this exact spot," said Brandon, not realizing he was revealing information he hadn't shared before. "There were valuable jewels hidden inside this wood." "But how do you know that for sure?" asked Margaret, her voice betraying a hint of the pain she felt. Brandon realized he had said too much, but it was too late. "Uncle left more detailed instructions than I had mentioned." "What instructions?" "I never saw anything beyond that vague map you showed me." The tension in the air was palpable. David knew he was witnessing the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. "Aunt Margaret, let's not fight about this now. The important thing is to find out who stole what was ours." "Ours?" asked Margaret, her voice growing firmer. "I thought it was mine. They were the jewels my husband hid for me." Brandon realized he was being cornered, and his mask of the helpful nephew began to slip. "Technically, Aunt, after the papers you signed, I have legal responsibility over all assets left by Uncle Richard." "What legal responsibility?" Margaret's voice was rising. "You told me they were papers to protect me from debts, and they are. But they also transfer asset management to someone more capable of handling complex financial matters." David knew it was time to intervene. If he let the situation continue, Brandon could manipulate Margaret again. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, "would you like me to take you home? It seems you have family matters to resolve." "No," said Margaret, with a determination that surprised everyone. "I want to resolve this here and now. Brandon, I want to see exactly what papers I signed, and I want a full explanation of my rights." "Aunt, you're overreacting. You're letting your emotions get the better of you." "Don't treat me like I'm an incompetent child," exploded Margaret. "I'm a grown woman who cared for a sick husband for years and managed a home and a business. I can perfectly understand legal documents if someone explains them to me properly." Margaret's outburst caught Brandon by surprise. Clearly, he did not expect her to confront his actions so directly. "David," said Margaret, turning to him, "can you accompany me to a different attorney today? I want a second opinion on these documents." "Of course I can, Mrs. Margaret." Brandon saw he was losing control of the situation. His expression became more threatening. "Aunt Margaret, you may be making a serious mistake. Those papers also protect you from being held responsible for debts you don't even know exist." "What debts?" asked Margaret. "Richard told me there were some outstanding matters, but nothing I couldn't resolve by selling the house if necessary." "There are debts with dangerous people, Aunt. People who won't simply accept that you can't pay." David saw the intimidation attempt for what it was and decided to intervene again. "Mrs. Margaret, let's leave here and find an attorney right now. These matters are too important to be resolved in an abandoned lot." "I agree," said Margaret, clearly determined to discover the truth about her situation. As David and Margaret prepared to leave, Brandon made one last attempt to maintain control. "Aunt, if you void these papers, you'll be responsible for all of Uncle Richard's debts, and I can guarantee they are much more than you imagine." "Then I'll deal with it when the time comes," replied Margaret. "I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and deceived." On the way to the city, Margaret remained silent for a long time. David respected her space, understanding that she was processing Richard's betrayal and all its implications. "David," she finally said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." David's heart raced. Was this the moment to confess about the treasure? Of course, Mrs. Margaret. You can ask. Did you find anything in that tree trunk before we got there? David took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. Yes, I did. Margaret looked at him with an expression that mixed relief and sadness. I thought so. Your reaction when Richard found the marks on the trunk. You didn't seem surprised. Are you angry with me? Margaret reflected for a moment. I should be. But you could have kept everything and never told me about Richard. Instead, you're helping me uncover the truth about my own family. That tells me a lot about your character. Mrs. Margaret, I took a few small pieces, but most of the treasure is still there. And if we can prove that Richard deceived you, I promise to return everything. And if we can't, I'll still return everything. The only difference is that you'll have to deal with Richard alone. Margaret smiled for the first time since they had begun that difficult conversation. You're a good man, David. Your son can be proud of having a father with integrity. The mention of children made David remember everything that was at stake for his own family. But looking at Margaret, he knew he had made the right decision. The attorney they consulted, Attorney Harrison, confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions. The documents she had signed effectively transferred all rights to her late husband's assets to Richard. But this was obtained through deception, explained Attorney Harrison. If we can prove that you were deliberately misled about the contents of the documents, we can have them nullified in court. How can we prove that? Asked Margaret. We would need witnesses or recordings showing Richard admitting that he intentionally deceived you. David had a risky idea, but it might work. Mrs. Margaret, what if we got Richard to confess that he deceived you? How? We go back to the property and confront him with the treasure. If he thinks someone stole the jewels, he might end up revealing more than he should in an attempt to recover them. Attorney Harrison shook his head. It would be very dangerous, and even if he confessed, without a recording, it would just be your word against his. What if we had a recording? Asked David. The attorney considered the possibility. If it were obtained legally, it could be used as evidence, but you would have to be very careful. If Richard suspected he was being recorded, he could become violent. For the rest of the afternoon, David and Margaret planned how to approach Richard. They decided they would return to the property the next day, with David discreetly recording the conversation, while Margaret confronted her nephew about the documents she had signed. Are you sure you want to do this? Asked David. It could be dangerous. I'm sure, Margaret replied with determination. Richard betrayed me in the worst possible way. He used my trust and my grief to steal from me. I won't let that go. That night, David told Jennifer about the day's events. She supported his decision to help Margaret, but was worried about the risks. What if Richard finds out you recorded the conversation? We'll have to be careful, said David, but I can't let Margaret face this alone. And the treasure? Are you really going to return everything? David nodded. It's the right thing to do. If we can prove Richard deceived her, maybe she'll decide to share something with us out of gratitude, but I won't make my help conditional on that. Jennifer smiled and kissed her husband. I'm proud of you, David. You're doing the right thing, even if it's costing our family dearly. The next morning, David arrived at the property carrying a small bag where he had hidden a recorder he had borrowed from a friend. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, clearly nervous but determined. Brandon said he would come here early today with a larger team to investigate who tampered with the trunk, said Margaret. Perfect. The more people present, the better the evidence will be. When Brandon arrived, he brought with him not only Tyler, but also two men who were clearly not detection technicians. They had an intimidating appearance that made David question the wisdom of his plan. Aunt Margaret, said Brandon, clearly surprised to see her there. I didn't expect you to come today. I decided to personally oversee the investigations into my husband's jewels, replied Margaret, her voice firm. Brandon exchanged a glance with Tyler before responding. Of course, I brought a specialized team to find out who stole what was ours. Brandon, said Margaret, I need to clarify something about those papers I signed. Now is not the time for that, Aunt. We're dealing with a theft. That's exactly why I need to understand my legal rights, insisted Margaret. Do these documents give me the right to recover my husband's jewels? Brandon hesitated, clearly sensing the trap in the question. The documents protect you from complicated legal matters. That doesn't answer my question. If we find the jewels today, who gets them? David was discreetly recording, keeping the recorder hidden in his bag while pretending to help with the search. Aunt Margaret, you signed the asset management over to me. That means I have the authority to decide how to use anything we find to settle Uncle Richard's debts. What debts exactly? Asked Margaret. I want to see documents that prove these debts. Brandon began to grow visibly agitated. They're complex matters you wouldn't understand. Try to explain it to me. I'm smarter than you think. One of the men Brandon had brought approached him and whispered something in his ear. Brandon nodded and turned to Margaret with a harder expression. Aunt, you're asking too many questions. This could attract unwanted attention to our family. Attention from whom? Margaret was not backing down. Brandon, I need the truth. Did you deceive me when you had me sign those papers? I protected you from having to make difficult decisions. That's not an answer, yes or no. Did you deceive me about the contents of the documents? Brandon looked around, realizing the conversation was being heard by everyone present. His expression became threatening. Aunt Margaret, you're making a very serious mistake. There are people who won't like seeing these family matters discussed publicly. David noticed the implied threat and decided to intervene. Mrs. Margaret, I think it's best we continue this conversation in a more appropriate place. No, said Margaret, with a courage that impressed David. Brandon, I want a clear answer. Did you deceive me or not? Brandon lost his patience. Yes, I simplified things for you. You're a widowed and emotional woman who doesn't have the capacity to handle complex financial matters. These papers ensure I can resolve everything in the most efficient way. Efficient for whom? Asked Margaret, tears in her eyes but her voice firm. For the whole family. Uncle Richard owed money to dangerous people. If I don't take responsibility for his assets, you could end up getting hurt. David continued recording, knowing Brandon was incriminating himself with every word. What dangerous people? Insisted Margaret. Brandon realized he had said too much, but it was too late to back down. People who financed your uncle's business in recent years. People who don't accept excuses or promises. People who collect their debts in ways you don't want to know. And you think deceiving your own aunt is the right way to handle this? David couldn't control himself and interrupted the conversation. Who are you to meddle in my family's affairs? Brandon turned to David angrily. Actually, I want to talk to you about another matter. What matter? About what you took from that trunk before we got there. David's heart raced, but he kept a calm expression. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. You're the one who opened the trunk and took the jewels. I want everything back now. Margaret looked at David with concern, realizing the situation was becoming dangerous. Brandon, stop this. David is only helping me. He's helping to rob our family, shouted Brandon. He manipulated you to find out where the treasure was, and then came back here alone to take everything. That's not true, said Margaret, but David noticed she was beginning to doubt. David made a quick decision. He took from his bag the pieces he had retrieved from the treasure and showed them to everyone. Is this what you're looking for? Brandon and his men immediately stepped closer, confirming for David that their intentions were not good. Where's the rest? Asked Brandon. What rest? David was trying to buy time, hoping Margaret would understand he was protecting her. Don't play innocent. Uncle Richard hid much more than this. How do you know what he hid? Margaret asked the question David had been waiting for. Brandon realized he had fallen into another trap. He left detailed instructions. What instructions? I never saw anything beyond that basic map. Aunt, you don't need to know all the details. Yes, I do. Brandon, tell me right now, how do you know exactly what my husband hid and where? Brandon looked at the men he had brought, as if asking permission to reveal something important. Because I was with him when he hid the jewels. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at her nephew with an expression of shock and betrayal that broke David's heart. You were with him? When? In the last few weeks before the end. He asked me to help him hide the most valuable pieces. And why did you never tell me this? Because he made me promise I would only reveal the location if you were in real financial danger. But I am in financial danger. You said yourself there are dangerous debts. Brandon realized he was contradicting himself. It's complicated, Aunt. Margaret stepped closer to her nephew, and David could see she was fighting back tears of anger and disillusionment. Brandon, stop lying to me. Your uncle was very weak in his last weeks. He could barely get out of bed. How could he have come here to hide anything? Brandon was clearly cornered, but made one last attempt to stick to his version of the facts. I brought him here. I helped because he insisted it was important. You're lying. Margaret could no longer contain herself. Richard spent the last 2 months in the hospital. You never brought him anywhere. David realized it was the perfect moment to reveal his final card. Mrs. Margaret, there's one more thing you need to know about your nephew. Brandon turned to David with a murderous expression. You know nothing about our family. I know that you illegally sold the land we're standing on right now. The impact of those words was immediate. Brandon paled, and Margaret stared at him in horror. What do you mean, sold the land? This land belonged to your husband, Mrs. Margaret. Brandon forged documents and sold it after his death, without your knowledge. Brandon, is this true? Margaret's voice was almost a whisper. Brandon tried one last desperate lie. Aunt, you don't understand the legal complexities. Yes or no, shouted Margaret, with a force that surprised everyone present. Brandon looked around, realizing there was no more room for lies. Yes, I sold it, but it was to pay off debts that would have destroyed the whole family. What authorization did you have to sell properties that weren't yours? I thought you would never know, and that it would be better this way. Margaret took a few steps back, as if Brandon's words were physical blows. Brandon, you stole from me. First with the papers you made me sign, then by selling properties that were mine. You betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. Aunt, I can explain. No! Margaret shouted with a strength that came from the depths of her soul. I don't want to hear your lies anymore. You took advantage of my grief, my trust, my naivety. You destroyed what was left of my family. Margaret's words echoed across the empty lot. David kept recording, knowing they had enough evidence to nullify the fraudulent documents. Brandon, realizing he had completely lost control of the situation, made one last desperate attempt. Aunt Margaret, you don't understand the danger you're in. The people Uncle Richard owed money to won't accept that you can't pay. If you nullify these papers and become responsible for the debt— What people? David intervened. David, you've talked a lot about these dangerous debts, but you've never shown proof of anything. Brandon hesitated, and David realized he had hit the mark. The debts exist, but they're not Uncle Richard's. They're yours, aren't they, Brandon? Brandon's silence confirmed David's suspicion. You incurred debts in the name of your sick uncle, and now you're trying to use his inheritance to pay them off, isn't that it? Margaret looked at Brandon with a mixture of horror and understanding. Brandon, answer. Are the debts yours or my husband's? Brandon lowered his head, finally defeated. They're mine. I invested in some businesses that went wrong. I needed money to pay, so I used my uncle's name as collateral. My God, whispered Margaret. You ruined my sick husband to cover your own financial mistakes. I was going to pay it all back. I just needed time. Pay back with what money? You just admitted your businesses failed. David knew he had recorded enough confessions to ensure Margaret regained her legal rights, but he also realized Brandon was becoming desperate, which could be dangerous. Mrs. Margaret, he said calmly, I think we've heard enough. Let's leave and let your attorney handle the rest. Brandon turned to David with an expression of pure hatred. You destroyed my family. I hope you're satisfied. You destroyed your own family when you decided to lie and steal from your aunt, replied David. I just revealed the truth. On the way back to the city, Margaret cried silently. David respected her grief, understanding she was processing not only the financial betrayal, but the collapse of her last meaningful family relationship. David, she finally said, thank you for not giving up on the truth, even when it would have been easier to just keep the jewelry and forget everything. You're welcome, Mrs. Margaret. You deserve to know the truth. What happens now? We'll take the recording to your attorney. With Brandon's confessions, it shouldn't be hard to nullify the fraudulent documents and recover your property. And the land he sold? If the sale was made with forged documents, it can be nullified too. It may take time, but you should be able to recover your rights. Margaret nodded, but David could see she was still processing the magnitude of the betrayal she had suffered. "About the jewels," said David, "I'll get the rest this afternoon and deliver everything to you." "David, you could have kept it all. You could have let me be deceived by Brandon and become rich. Why didn't you do that?" David thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because I have children, Mrs. Margaret, and I want them to grow up knowing their father is an honest man, even when honesty comes at a high cost." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Your children are very lucky." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. That afternoon, David returned to the lot to retrieve the remainder of the treasure. He was nervous about the possibility of Brandon waiting for him, but the place was deserted. He quickly gathered all the jewels and valuable items left in the trunk and took them directly to Margaret. When she saw the true extent of the treasure her husband had hidden, Margaret was silent for a long moment. "It's much more than I imagined," she said finally. "Richard was always careful, but I never knew he had managed to preserve so much." "They are truly valuable pieces," agreed David. "Enough to ensure you have financial security for the rest of your life." Margaret examined each piece carefully, and David could see that many of them held sentimental value beyond the monetary. "David, I want you to keep something. You saved not only my assets but my dignity. You deserve to be rewarded." "Mrs. Margaret, I didn't do this expecting a reward." "I know, and that's exactly why you deserve it. Besides, I'm going to need someone trustworthy to help me manage these assets. Brandon was the only family I had, and now you can always count on me to help you," said David, "but you don't need to give me anything in return." Margaret smiled and picked up one of the most valuable gold coins. "This one should be worth enough to solve your family's most urgent problems, and I want you to accept it as payment for the security services you'll provide for me from now on." "Security services?" "David, do you think Brandon will simply accept that he lost? Men like him don't give up easily. I'm going to need protection while the lawyers sort out this whole legal situation." David hadn't thought of that, but Margaret was right. Brandon had shown he was capable of anything to get money, and probably wouldn't be happy about losing everything. "You're right," said David. "I'll keep an eye on you, especially over the next few months." In the following weeks, events unfolded exactly as Margaret and David had predicted. With the recordings as evidence, Attorney Harrison was able to quickly nullify the fraudulent documents that Brandon had made Margaret sign. Brandon tried to contest the charges, but his own recorded confessions made it impossible to deny his guilt. Furthermore, investigations revealed he had committed other frauds beyond the illegal sale of the lot. The situation became more complicated when Brandon's real creditors appeared demanding payment for the debts he had incurred in the name of Margaret's late husband. But with the correct legal documents, it was possible to prove that Richard had never authorized those loans. David used the money from the coin Margaret had given him to pay all his family's overdue bills and buy the school supplies Michael needed. Jennifer was moved when she learned of the honest resolution of the whole situation. "You did the right thing, David," she said, hugging her husband, "and you ended up being rewarded for your honesty." "The best reward was seeing Mrs. Margaret get back what was hers," replied David. "Money is important, but it's worthless if you lose your dignity to get it." Michael was especially proud when David told the adapted version of the story, emphasizing the importance of always doing the right thing, even when it's hard. "Dad, you're a hero," said the boy, hugging David. "When I grow up, I want to have integrity like you." But the story was far from over. 3 weeks after Brandon's exposure, David was working at his new occupation, looking after Margaret's security, when he noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front of her house. He approached cautiously and saw Margaret talking with an elegant woman he had never seen before. When Margaret spotted him, she waved him over. "David, I want you to meet Dr. Rebecca Collins. She's a curator at a museum in Los Angeles and came to speak with me about some of the pieces we found." The woman extended her hand politely. "Pleasure to meet you, David. Mrs. Margaret told me how you helped her recover her inheritance. Pleasure, Doctor. What can I do for you? Actually, perhaps I can do something for you. Some of the pieces you found have significant historical value beyond their monetary worth. The museum would be interested in purchasing them for amounts that could be far above what you could get on the common market. David and Margaret exchanged a look. This was a possibility they had never considered. What kind of historical value? Asked Margaret. Well, some of these coins are from specific periods in American history. And there's a necklace that appears to have belonged to an important family from the colonial period. If our assessment is correct, these pieces could be worth much more than you imagine. During the appraisal of the pieces, which lasted all afternoon, David and Margaret discovered the treasure was even more valuable than they had imagined. Some pieces were truly of national historical importance. Your husband had a great deal of knowledge about antiques, commented Dr. Rebecca. These aren't pieces one acquires by accident. Richard was always fascinated by history, said Margaret. He collected old things since he was young. Well, his collection turned out to be a better investment than he probably imagined. If you decide to sell to the museum, you could receive enough to live comfortably for the rest of your lives and still leave something substantial for the family. After Dr. Rebecca's departure, Margaret sat down with David to discuss the options they had. It's a lot of money, David. More than I ever imagined existed. What do you want to do? Margaret thought for a long moment. I want to keep some pieces that have sentimental value, the ones Richard gave me as gifts over the years. But the rest, I think it would be good to know they're being preserved in a museum where other people can appreciate them. And the money from the sale. Part of it I want to use to create a fund that helps other people in my situation. Widows who have been deceived by family or are struggling financially. David smiled. Even with the possibility of extraordinary wealth, Margaret was thinking about how she could help others. It's a beautiful idea, Mrs. Margaret. And I want you to be my partner in this project. You understand what it's like to face financial hardship, but you've also proven you have the integrity needed to handle significant resources. It would be an honor, said David, moved by the proposal. The sale of the historical pieces to the museum was completed 2 months later, generating an amount that surpassed all of Margaret's and David's expectations. With part of the money, Margaret bought a larger and more comfortable house, but not excessively luxurious. David used his share to open a small security company that employed other unemployed men from the area. Jennifer was finally able to realize her dream of completing her studies by enrolling in a university course. But the most important project was the creation of the Richard Foster Foundation, dedicated to helping people in situations of financial and legal vulnerability. Margaret and David worked together, managing the foundation, investigating cases, and providing legal assistance for people who couldn't defend themselves alone. The first case they solved was that of a 70-year-old woman whose son had sold her house without authorization. With the experience gained from Margaret's own case, they managed to prove the fraud and recover the property. Brandon, meanwhile, faced the legal consequences of his actions. He was sued for document fraud, embezzlement, and illegal sale of property. He ended up being sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to return everything he had stolen from Margaret. Interestingly, it was in prison that Brandon began to reflect on his choices. He wrote letters to Margaret asking for forgiveness, but she decided not to answer them immediately. The process of forgiving would take time. It still hurts a lot, Margaret confessed to David one day, while they were working on a similar case at the foundation. Brandon wasn't just my nephew, he was like a son to me. Richard and I never had children of our own, so Brandon occupied that place in my heart. Forgiveness doesn't have to be immediate, said David, and forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or allowing him to hurt you again. I know. Maybe one day, when he truly understands what he did and shows genuine change, I might find a place in my heart to forgive him, but that will take a long time. 1 year after the discovery of the treasure, David and Margaret organized a party to celebrate the first anniversary of the Richard Foster Foundation. They gathered all the families they had helped, the foundation's employees, and friends they had made during this journey. Jennifer was radiant, showing her certificate for completing her first year of university. Michael had won first place at the school science fair with a project on honesty and integrity. Little David, the youngest son, played in the garden with other children. "You changed our lives," Jennifer said to Margaret during the party. "Not just financially, but you gave us a mission, a greater purpose." "You are the ones who changed my life," replied Margaret. "Richard always said that God puts the right people in our path when we need them most. David appeared exactly when I was about to lose everything that remained of my life." During the party, Attorney Harrison, the lawyer who had helped them, made a toast. "We are here celebrating more than the success of a foundation. We are celebrating proof that honesty is still worth it, that doing the right thing, even when it costs dearly, always ends up being rewarded." David looked around the party, seeing all the people whose lives had been positively touched by the decision he had made that crucial day on the abandoned lot. If he had chosen to simply keep the treasure and never tell Margaret about his discovery, none of that would have happened. "What are you thinking about?" asked Jennifer, approaching her husband. "I'm thinking about how one small decision can change so many lives," replied David. "If I had chosen the easy path that day—" "But you didn't," said Margaret, who had approached to listen to the conversation. "And that's the difference between men of integrity and men like Brandon." As the night went on, people shared their stories. There was a lady who had recovered her retirement stolen by her son-in-law, an elderly man who managed to prove that his land had not been legally sold by his children, a young mother who regained custody of her children after proving that her ex-husband had falsified documents. Each story was a small victory against injustice, proof that with determination and proper resources, even ordinary people could fight for their rights. "Do you know what the most important part of all this is?" said Margaret, as people gathered to listen. "It's not the money we managed to recover or the legal victories we achieved. It's the dignity we restored to these people. It's looking into the eyes of an 80-year-old woman and seeing that she has regained her faith in justice." David nodded, remembering how he felt when he realized he could make a difference in Margaret's life. It was a feeling that was priceless. "And the most beautiful part," David added, "is that every person we help leaves here knowing they can count on us if they need to again. We're not just solving problems, we're building a support network." The party continued late into the night, with people sharing meals, laughter, and hopes for the future. Buddy, now older but still David's faithful companion, moved among the guests, receiving affection from everyone. When everyone had finally left, David, Jennifer, and Margaret stayed in the garden organizing the final details. "David," said Margaret, "I want you to know that I consider you the son I never had. Richard would be so proud to see how you've taken care of me." "And I consider you the mother I lost when I was very young," replied David, moved. "You taught me that true wealth isn't in what we possess, but in what we do for others." Jennifer hugged them both. "We're a family now, a chosen family, formed through adversity and mutual trust." 2 years later, the Richard Foster Foundation had expanded to 3 cities in the region. David had become an expert in detecting family fraud, while Margaret used her personal experience to counsel other victims of betrayal. Michael, now 10 years old, often accompanied his father to work and had become interested in social justice issues. Little David showed signs of having inherited his father's integrity, always standing up for the younger children at school. Jennifer had graduated in social work and was now officially working at the foundation, specializing in cases involving vulnerable families. Brandon had served his sentence and tried several times to contact Margaret. She finally agreed to meet him but set clear conditions. He would have to work to prove he had genuinely changed, and any attempt at manipulation would result in a definitive end to any relationship between them. "Aunt Margaret," said Brandon during their first meeting after his release, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way. But I want you to know that these years in prison made me understand the difference between wanting something and deserving something." Margaret studied him carefully. "Brandon, forgiveness is a process. I can't simply decide to forgive you because you seem remorseful. You need to demonstrate through consistent actions over time that you have truly changed. I understand and I accept that. I don't expect it to be easy or quick. If you have really changed, you will find a way to rebuild your life without harming other people. And perhaps one day we can have some kind of relationship again, but it will be a completely different relationship from what we had before. Brandon nodded, and Margaret could see that his experience had truly marked him. Only time would tell if the change was genuine. 5 years after the discovery of the treasure, David was invited to give a lecture at a university on business ethics and social responsibility. It was something he had never imagined doing when he worked chopping wood on the abandoned property. "The most important decision I ever made in my life," he said to a room full of students, "wasn't when I chose to start my own company or when I decided to get married. It was when I found a treasure that could solve all my financial problems and chose to do the right thing instead of the easy thing." A student raised his hand. "Professor David, have you ever regretted that decision? Have you thought about how different your life would be if you had kept the money?" David smiled. "Every day I see how different my life is for having made the right choice. I have a close family, work that I love, true friends, and the certainty that I can sleep peacefully every night. If I had kept the stolen money, I might be richer financially, but I would be poorer in every way that truly matters." Another student asked, "How did you know you were doing the right thing? Didn't you have doubts?" "Of course I had doubts. My children needed things I couldn't buy. My wife was worried about our finances. But I asked myself, what kind of man do I want to be? What kind of example do I want to set for my children? And I realized that no amount of money is worth more than being able to look my children in the eye and know I am a man of integrity." After the lecture, several students approached David to ask personal questions about applying ethical principles in their future careers. He was impressed by how seriously the young people took these issues. "Professor," said one student, "my father always told me that in the real world, honest people get left behind. Your story gives me hope that isn't true." "Your story taught me that honesty and success aren't opposites," added another student. "In fact, one depends on the other to be sustainable." On the way back home, David reflected on how his life had transformed. The man who had struggled to cut a stubborn log 5 years ago was now respected in his community as an example of integrity. When he arrived home, he found Margaret helping Jennifer prepare dinner, while Michael taught his younger brother to play chess. It was a scene of domestic happiness that warmed his heart. "How was the lecture?" asked Jennifer, kissing her husband. "Amazing. Those young people are really interested in making a difference in the world. Just like their father," said Margaret, smiling. "Richard always said that one person of integrity can inspire hundreds of others to be honest too." Michael interrupted the chess game and approached his father. "Dad, my teacher said I'll represent the school in a citizenship essay contest. Can I write about your story?" David knelt down to his son's level. "Of course, Michael, but remember, the story isn't about me being special. It's about anyone being able to choose to do the right thing even when it's hard." "I understand, Dad. It's about choosing who we want to be." That night, when the whole family was asleep, David went out to the backyard and looked at the stars. Buddy came over and lay down beside him, as he always did whenever he sensed his owner was in a contemplative mood. "You were there at the beginning of it all, weren't you, Buddy?" said David, petting the dog's head. "If you could talk, what would you say about this whole journey?" Buddy just looked at him with those wise eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog should. David thought about the log that had resisted all his saws, forcing him to use his grandfather's axe and, consequently, to discover the treasure. If the wood hadn't been so tough, he could have cut the log without ever discovering what was hidden inside. It was as if everything had been orchestrated to test his character at the crucial moment. And although it took time to fully understand, he now saw that every difficulty he had faced in life had prepared him to make the right decision when it truly mattered. The next day, David received an unexpected call. It was Dr. Rebecca, the museum curator, who had purchased the historical pieces. "David, I have some very interesting news. Do you remember that necklace you found? The one we thought belonged to a colonial family?" "Yes, I remember." "Well, our research revealed it belonged to one of the first abolitionist families in the United States. The National Museum wants to create a special exhibition on the history of abolition and would like to include this piece. They are offering a substantial amount just for the right to display it for 1 year." David was silent for a moment, processing the information. Dr. Rebecca, that's Mrs. Margaret's decision. The piece belongs to her. Actually, David, Mrs. Margaret told me to speak with you. She wants you both to decide together how to use this opportunity. When David told Margaret about the National Museum's proposal, she had an idea that surprised him. David, let's use that money to expand our foundation nationally. Imagine how many people we could help if we had the resources to work across the entire country. It's an ambitious idea, said David, but it's also risky. Managing something of that size requires experience we don't have. Then let's seek that experience. Let's hire professionals, form partnerships with universities, create a solid structure. We have the moral foundation and the practical experience. We can learn the rest. The idea was both intimidating and exciting. David knew it would be an enormous challenge, but it also represented the opportunity to multiply the positive impact they were already making. During the following months, David and Margaret traveled to several cities across the country, studying how other similar organizations worked and identifying the specific needs of each region. In Los Angeles, they found cases of elderly people being deceived by sophisticated scammers. In Miami, they discovered families losing their homes due to bureaucratic tricks. In the South, they saw simple people being exploited by opportunists posing as lawyers. It's impressive how the same kind of injustice happens everywhere, observed Margaret during one of their trips. And always with the same victims, vulnerable people who trust in the kindness of others. But it's also impressive how many good people there are willing to help, replied David. In every city we visited, we found decent people wanting to make a difference. The national expansion of the Richard Foster Foundation took 2 years to implement completely. When it was finally inaugurated, the organization had offices in 10 states and a staff of 50 employees. Brandon, who had genuinely strived to rebuild his life, asked to work voluntarily at the foundation. Margaret hesitated for a long time before accepting. "You can work with us," she finally said, "but on one condition. Any sign that you're returning to your old ways and our relationship ends definitively." "I understand and accept," replied Brandon. "I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the harm I did." To everyone's surprise, Brandon proved to be a dedicated and honest employee. His experience with fraud, now seen from the victim's side, made him especially effective at identifying scams similar to those he himself had once carried out. "So it's strange," Margaret commented to David one day, "but perhaps Brandon needs this experience to truly understand what he did to me." "People can change," said David. "Not always, and not easily, but they can." 10 years after the discovery of the treasure, David's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. From an unemployed firewood seller, he had become the national director of one of the largest consumer protection organizations in the country. Michael, now 18 years old, had decided to study law to continue the family's work. Little David, 15, showed a talent for technology and wanted to create systems to make the foundation's services more efficient. Jennifer had completed her master's in social work and become a nationally recognized expert in protecting vulnerable people. Margaret, at 75, remained active in the foundation, but had begun delegating more responsibilities to David and Jennifer. Her greatest joy was seeing how her decision to trust David had created waves of positive impact that now reached thousands of people. "Richard would be proud," she said to David during the celebration of the foundation's 10th anniversary. "Not just of what we managed to build, but of how we managed to build it, always doing the right thing." "Do you think he knew?" asked David. "When he hid the treasure in that log, do you think he imagined it would lead to all this?" Margaret smiled. "Richard always said that when we do something with love and care, we never know how far the positive consequences can reach. Maybe he didn't know exactly what would happen, but he had faith that his good intentions would eventually yield good results." During the party, David was approached by a young journalist who wanted to write a book about the foundation's story. "Mr. David, what would you say was the most important moment in this entire journey?" David reflected on the question. There had been so many crucial moments: discovering the treasure, deciding to tell Margaret the truth, confronting Brandon, expanding nationally. "The most important moment," he finally said, "was when I realized that the saw wouldn't cut that log for a reason. If I had managed to cut the wood easily, I would never have discovered what was inside. Sometimes, the resistances we encounter in life are there to force us to discover more important things. What message would you leave for people facing difficulties similar to those you faced? That there is no problem so big that it cannot be solved with honesty, persistence, and a willingness to do the right thing, and that sometimes helping others is the best way to help yourself. As the party was coming to an end, David looked around and saw all the people whose lives had been touched by the decision he had made on that crucial day 10 years ago. It was a crowd of smiling faces, each representing a victory against injustice. Buddy, now an elderly but still loyal dog, was lying near David's feet. The animal had been present at every important moment of this journey, a silent symbol of loyalty and unconditional love. "Thank you, Buddy," David whispered to the dog, "for being there from the beginning." Jennifer approached and took her husband's hand. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking that if I had a time machine and could go back to that day on the lot, I would make exactly the same choice, even knowing everything we would have to face, especially knowing everything we managed to build," replied David, looking at their children playing with other kids in the garden. "Our difficulties made us stronger. Our challenges taught us to value what really matters." Margaret joined the conversation, carrying a cup of coffee and smiling with the satisfaction of someone who sees a job well done. "Do you know what the best part of all this is?" she asked. "What?" asked David and Jennifer together. "It's knowing that the story doesn't end here. Michael and David Jr. will continue this work, and they will inspire other people to do the same. What started with a stubborn log will keep spreading for generations." David nodded, moved by the thought. It was true. They hadn't just solved a problem but created a movement that would continue to grow even after they were no longer there. As the last guests said their goodbyes at the party, David walked to the spot in the garden where he had planted a sapling from the tree that produced the trunk where it all began. The tree was now over 10 feet tall and stood strong and healthy. "One day," he said to Jennifer and Margaret, "our grandchildren will play in the shade of this tree, and when they ask about its story, we'll tell them how it all started with the decision to do the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. And they will learn that honesty is more than a virtue," added Margaret. "It's a force that can change the world." End of story. And you, dear listener, what did you think of this story of perseverance and honesty? Do you believe David made the right choice in choosing integrity, even while facing financial difficulties? Share your opinion in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories that show how small choices can lead to big transformations.